Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Eric Farnsworth, Vice President at the America Society, Council of the Americas, and our esteemed panel.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Come on, you can do better than that. Let's try this one again. Good afternoon, everybody. There you go. It's great to be back in Miami. This is actually my first time back from Washington in the 2.5 years since the pandemic began, and it's great to be back. It's great to see all of you, and it's really great to be here with the Concordia team putting on the annual Americas Conference. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to moderate this panel, which is designed to discuss trade and investment in the Western Hemisphere and how we can build that out together. My name is Eric Farnsworth, as you heard from the voice of God, and it is really something that from the Council of the Americas perspective we are focused on quite a lot. How are we going to be able to build trade and investment in the Western Hemisphere during this time? And you know, it's sometimes politically complicated to talk about trade in Washington, as all of our panelists very well know. But at this particular moment in history, it really shouldn't be that complicated. The United States has a lot of jobs which are not being filled in the current moment. The United States has high inflation. Both of those would be addressed by expanding trade. At the same time, in the region, we have a lot of political shifts. Leaders coming into office who have promised big things for their people which require big resources. Where are those resources going to come from? At the same time, the dollar is historically high against global currencies. What does that mean? Exports from the region are now incredibly competitive, including tourism exports, if the region builds its own competitiveness to take advantage of this moment in time. And so we're going to talk about that with our expert panelists. And the first one to my immediate right, to your left, from the U.S. Department of Commerce is Ian Saunders, Deputy Assistant Secretary. I've known him for quite some time. We're in for a treat. Ian, you know, from the Commerce Department, these are big issues. Give us a sense of what some of your priorities are in building the trade and investment agenda in the Western Hemisphere.
So 3 issues. Eric, thanks for the opportunity to speak, and thanks to Concordia for the opportunity to be here on this panel. 3 of the issues that we look at primarily as we organize our thinking around how to promote trade and commercial relationships in the hemisphere are competitiveness, transparency, and security. Competitiveness, Eric has spoken to some of the elements that go into that, but looking at the market landscape and understanding what are the things that can be done to ensure that the advantages that the region does have are actually able to shine through. Some of the things that we hear from the private sector involve things like the nature of regulatory practice, predictability of treatment, time of border clearance, very practical issues that go to the nature of costs and the calculus that companies make in terms of their willingness to invest in the region. Transparency, the second item that I talked about, is a critical part of that, because a good chunk of dealing with legitimate trade is offering companies the opportunity to understand what the rules of engagement are so that they can comply, because frankly it's often too expensive for them not to comply. But that requires having relationships and providing information so that they can comply with the rules that are set before them. And then the third area that I mentioned is security, and I look at security in a very broad sense because I think one of the lessons that we've all learned from the pandemic is that the supply chains are not guaranteed. Availability of goods is not guaranteed. So what are the areas that we need to focus on to avoid some of the shortcomings that we've just experienced in the past 2.5 years, and make sure that as we're looking at how to promote trade in the region, we're doing so in a way that makes sense given the needs that we've all felt throughout the hemisphere?
Absolutely, and you've mentioned supply chains. It's the word of the day, or the phrase of the day. Jason, I'm going to come to you. Jason Marczak with the Atlantic Council, former colleague of mine and continued friend of mine, and delighted to work with you again on this panel, Jason. Supply chains, look, this should be an obvious win for Latin America and the Caribbean. The President of Mexico was just in Washington these last couple days. And yet, we're not seeing the results we would have anticipated, perhaps going back 2 years in the pandemic, in terms of Latin America's capturing of some of those supply chains. Why not? What can we do better?
Well, thanks, Eric, and thanks to Concordia, Ian, and Jonathan. Great to be with you on this panel. I think one of the big challenges with supply chains in the hemisphere right now, and Ian, you were alluding to this as well, is the need for legal certainty, the need for communication with the public and private sectors, and the need for also adaptation, right? The world is quickly changing, and our supply chains are quickly changing. We need to update the way in which governments and the private sector are working together. Look at the shortages that we saw during COVID, the PPE shortages, the vaccine shortages. What was critical during that time was to get the pharmaceutical industry, get health ministers together to think through what type of regulatory barriers needed to be overcome in a quick, nimble way to be able to ensure that health equipment got to different countries. Right now, we're facing incredible food security challenges. Over 40 million people globally, because the Russians' invasion of Ukraine, will suffer from food security. That means millions of people across Latin America and the Caribbean. Those are critical issues in which we need to be nimble as a think tank community, as the public sector, as the private sector, and thinking through how do we push through some of those barriers, and how do we also ensure that there is that certainty to make sure that supply chains are able to respond to the people's needs across the hemisphere.
So if you were advising a foreign government, a government in Latin America and the Caribbean, about supply chains and capturing some of what the private sector, I'm going to come to the private sector in just a second, is looking to do, moving out of China, for example, or moving into a more resilient supply chain scenario, what would you advise them to do? Just one or two ideas.
Yeah, I would say for governments across the hemisphere, it's absolutely fundamental to have stability in the rule of law. I mean, this is what businesses are looking at. It's also, you look at the risk-reward quotient. This is how businesses determine investment. Determine investment based on where is there the greatest reward and the lowest amount of risk. And so flipping that equation so that Latin America and the Caribbean has higher reward, lower risk, that's going to bring more investment into the region.
Jonathan, let's get real here. You're with the private sector, you're with GM. In the context of, you've done a lot of work on innovation, you've done a lot of work on technology. These are global issues. This isn't a Latin America, Caribbean issue.
Yep.
And yet, when you survey the region, what do you see? And as what Jason and Ian have been talking about, is this a region that's ripe for the type of investment, cutting edge, innovative investment that GM or the pharmaceutical sector are looking to make?
Thanks, Eric, and thanks for the panel, and thanks to Matt and Concordia for having us. This is one of the best venues we have in the country. So to your question, I just want to echo what Ian and Jason just said on transparency and security, rule of law, and predictability, regulatory predictability. So getting back to your question more specifically, the answer is yes and no. We just announced, I think in April, with our international president, with President Duque, we're going to invest another $50 million into a plant in Colombia. That's in addition to another $250 million over the last 10 years we've invested in that plant. We've created over 800 jobs directly and about 16,000 indirectly. But that's because Colombia has a structure where it allows us to have less risk and more reward and predictability, regulatory predictability. Ecuador, we've been in Colombia for 66 years. I think Ecuador about 27 years. Chevy's #1. So we have a great long relationship. You have to look at this in the old-fashioned manufacturing way and then in the new innovation, technology, data, software way. So one of the things we're looking at in the Indo-Pacific is Indo-Pacific Economic Framework that the administration has rolled out, and specifically on the digital side with all the new technologies. What do we do with data, and how do you do data transfer? And so if there's not, we have free trade agreements like USMCA and US-Japan where there are specific digital data sections in there. But how do we do that when all these new technologies are being introduced in Latin America? There's some talk of doing something like the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, not necessarily a free trade agreement, but an economic agreement. And we need things like that. We need regulatory certainty. We need rule of law. Because we're investing hundreds of millions, billions of dollars, and we need to make sure we're going to get a return on it.
Absolutely, and look, you just rang the bell for the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, so it's a perfect segue into Ian, because it allows me to ask the question you knew was coming. We just came out of the Summit of the Americas in Los Angeles. The president announced a similar framework to the Indo-Pacific, although we're not quite sure exactly what it means in the context of the Americas. Can you talk to us a little bit about, I know you're not from USTR, I know you're not from the White House, so all the appropriate caveats, but from your perspective, where do you sense the administration heading on some of these issues? What is the America's economic framework that the president announced in Los Angeles?
Well, Erica, those caveats are important because we're at a stage.
Yeah, I'm
where
giving you a way out here, my friend.
there's not much I'm going to be able to say, but I think that something to take away from this is that the decision to pursue the partnership is a recognition that these issues do matter for the region. Now, the work needs to be done now to define what is behind the 4 pillars of the framework, and that is work that USTR, State Department, and others in the interagency will be leading. So really defining what are the details that we want to pursue, and being able to provide a clear picture to other countries so that we have a sense of what we're asking them to subscribe to. So that is the work that still needs to be done. But I think the takeaway at this point is that there's a recognition in the administration that these issues do matter, and we want to go with them in a structured and deliberate way.
Thank you. And can I ask you a sense of prioritization of some of these issues? You look at these issues, you're in an agency with a global perspective. We face big issues in our own country, obviously. Where do the Americas, where does Latin America fit in? Or a different way to ask this question, to follow up what you just said, is there urgency to some of these issues in a way that, you know, we're all, I think, as Latin Americanists would love to see? How do we envision, and I'm not trying to put you on the spot here, but I'm trying to really tease this out. From the outside perspective, how should we be viewing these issues as a priority?
So I think, Eric, that there is a sense of urgency, and I think there's one that's recognized. A phrase I actually heard my Secretary Raimondo, use in a panel yesterday is that there's a generational opportunity here. So in the wake of the pandemic, and as we ask the supply chain question, there are very important and time-bound decisions being made on where to go. And so looking at these enabling conditions, how to make the region more competitive, is, I think, a time-bound question, because once decisions are made to commit the resources elsewhere to some other part of the world, those decisions will be very difficult to unwind. So there's work to be done, I think, in the very near term to make sure that the opportunity that exists is something that the private sector is comfortable following through on. The level of interest is there. As I look at the trade mission that we had in South America in May, we had 69 companies there. It confirms that the interest is there, but following up on that interest in a real world way means that the conditions need to be right for companies to move.
I think that point you just made is so fundamental and so good. We have a window, but the window's closing, right? And once those corporate investments are made, they're not going to shift. So if they go from China to Vietnam, they're not going to go from China to Mexico or China to Colombia or China to Central America. Thank you. That was really good. It helps us clarify and help think through some of these issues. Jason, I want to take a sub-regional approach for you on the next question. You've done a lot of work on Central America. You teach about it at George Washington University, some of these other issues. The administration's made a real commitment to Central America. The vice president, the call to action, there is investment that's going in, and yet the problems that we heard about from the last speaker, right, the migration issues, just don't seem to be getting traction. I mean, what are we missing here? Is there a magic bullet, or help us think that one through?
Yeah, that's a great question, Eric. And now, before answering that, I think one other key, when we're looking at the region writ large, talking about the window that's closing, there's also China, right? And the window is quickly closing because of China's increased trade and economic relationships across the region. We did a report last year that looked at the fact that looking out to 2035, China's trade relationship with the region should potentially double from 2020 figures over the course of the next 13 years, grow by 1.8 times the global average. And so as that competition and the competition from Chinese state-owned enterprises makes it very difficult for a lot of U.S. companies to be able to compete in the region. And it also further erodes some of the transparency, the legal certainty that is so desired for U.S. and Western companies to be able to work across the region. Now, in Central America specifically, the problem is there is no magic bullet, Eric, and we all know this so well. And the challenges of Central America are not going to be solved in one administration or two administrations. These are challenges that we've seen for decades. And what is critical is to have a long-term commitment to the region that goes beyond the administration, long-term congressional commitment to the region. Frankly, this is, as we know, one of the reasons that the partnership with Colombia has been so successful over the years is because the commitment went beyond one administration. It was Republican commitment, it was Democrat commitment. And to look at that commitment insofar as being the investments that have been announced are very important as part of the Partnership for Central America. But what's even more important is finding those long-term ways to be able to build the private sector in countries themselves, and also to be able to facilitate U.S. investment that makes the region attractive. How do you make the region more attractive? You have to connect the region more to the world. We have to connect Central America more to North America. We have to update CAF to DR so that it's more responsive to the textile export potential of 2022 rather than when the agreement was first negotiated.
Thank you. And I would actually take it further than that. My own personal view is that the countries of CAF to DR should be invited to accede to USMCA. I mean, updating CAF to DR I don't think is good enough in the current environment. I really think that they need to, from the supply chain perspective, from the private sector perspective, be fully integrated into the North American space. And I wouldn't stop with CAF to DR. I would make this an opening to countries that prove themselves ready. Look, the obligations of CAF to DR are not easy to achieve, so not every country would automatically be eligible. No. But that would be a good place to start.
And I would add to that as well, infrastructure integration. So the trade agreement integration, but also infrastructure integration into North America so those products from Central America can reach the U.S. in a very timely way.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Jonathan, you have talked about legal certainty and the enabling environment. From a pragmatic perspective, when you're looking to make investments around the world, not just Latin America, but how much weight or importance does the company give to the existence of a free trade agreement with the United States?
A lot. I mean, there's so many, we're one of the most regulated industries already. The supply chain issue, as we discussed, is a problem. Not only supply chain, but also the access to materials, critical minerals, things like that. Like I mentioned with the digital section of IPEF, Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, what do we do? A lot of our new technologies are going to have a lot of data. We're going to need to store it. We're going to need to transfer it. So we need certainty around all these things. We're coming on autonomy. So our cars are going to be more and more autonomous. Is the regulatory framework, in the US it's not ready. So is the regulatory framework going to be welcoming for cars that drive themselves and the data coming off of them and transferring? So, and then, are we able to produce things? Are we able to move them? Are we able to, some of the cars we produce in China have 25% tariffs. How do you make money on those cars? So it is critical for us to have some kind of economic framework agreement. That's why we're helping with Indo-Pacific framework and the Quad and the TTC and the EU so much. We're behind the scenes trying to work on model language, trying to make sure that we're being helpful and useful to the administration to make sure the language is right.
If you were to be asked, like I'm going to ask you right now, would you like to give a positive example of a country that's doing it right or mostly right, and it doesn't have to be in Latin America and the Caribbean? Is there an economy or a country that comes into your mind that could serve kind of as a guide star for what people are maybe trying to do?
Yeah, I think in Latin America, the ones I mentioned, including Mexico, we have a huge plant in Silao, Mexico. We have a great working relationship with them. Ecuador and the plant in Colombia that we just put another 50 million in. And that plant actually, I think 70% of the cars that come out of that plant are exported to elsewhere in South America. And on the autonomy side, we're working on it in the US, but Dubai, of all places, decided that they would change their federal motor vehicle safety standards to allow us to go test and deploy in Dubai. So they're changing their regulatory regime for us to go test these new technologies, and it's obviously welcoming to us.
Let me just say that as somebody who's traveled across Latin America quite a bit and sat in many traffic jams, I hope you're successful. As I hope you're successful in the Washington, D.C. context too as well. We don't have a lot of time left, but all three gentlemen, I'd like to give you the opportunity to make a last word. If there's a topic or a brief point that you'd like to make that we haven't necessarily covered, or you want to clarify, or you want to extend your comments in some way. I don't have all the answers necessarily. I just ask questions, but maybe I haven't asked the right questions. So Ian, to you, from your perspective, in 30 seconds, do you have, what's the last word you want to leave us with?
I think I would say that the interest is there, and it's an opportunity for countries to look at what the environmental issues are that will allow companies to actually capitalize on the advantages that the region has.
And when you're talking environmental issues, you're talking about investment climate.
Regulatory, trade facilitation, procurement practices, those things that color the business environment and inform the decisions of companies that are interested in the region.
Excellent. Jason?
We have to begin to prepare now for the next pandemic or the next major trade disruption. We were caught flat-footed by COVID, especially U.S.-Mexico trade with respect to what were deemed essential industries and what were not, and that really stymied the U.S. Ability to work with Mexico at that time. And so that's critical right now to be able to think ahead, not just plan for the issues of today, but the issues of tomorrow.
Yeah, thinking ahead isn't oftentimes the easiest thing to do in the political context.
No, it isn't.
You know, speaking, again, coming from Washington.
Exactly.
Jonathan, final 30 seconds.
Yeah, so just to reiterate, regulatory certainty, transparency, rule of law, everything we talked about. We love working with the government. It really is a private-public partnership. That's the only way to do it, and we look forward to doing that with Latin American countries, other countries, and trying to figure out these supply chain issues. We're going to invest, you know, untold amounts of money somewhere, and we need to make sure that where we do it, that the supply chain and the access to labor and materials and everything is secure and safe.
I mean, in their own way, everybody said essentially the same thing. The opportunity is now, right? So, you know, shame on all of us if we don't seize it. Shame on the region if it doesn't see that opportunity and move with alacrity to seize it. Shame on us. So the partnership is real. Hopefully together we can make it a reality. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please join me in thanking our panelists for their terrific comments and the discussion this afternoon.